Klaus Schmidt was a German archaeologist with decades of experience across the Near East when, in 1994, he traveled to a hill in southeastern Turkey whose flint fragments had been noted by an earlier survey 3 decades before, then set aside. The mound assumed to hold little more than a medieval graveyard. Schmidt suspected otherwise. Within his first hours walking the site, he later said he understood he wasn't looking at a cemetery at all. What lay beneath that hill would turn out to be older than Stonehenge by roughly 6,000 years. Older than the pyramids by 7,000. Older, in fact, than the earliest well-established farming communities in the region. That last part is the problem. For over a century, the story of civilization ran in one direction. Humans settled down, planted crops, grew a surplus of food, and only then, once their bellies were full and their days had leisure in them, did they build temples and invent gods. Farming came first. Religion, culture, monuments, those were luxuries earned by full granaries. It made sense. It was tidy. And at a hill called Göbekli Tepe, that tidy order appears to break down, because the people who raised the carved limestone pillars found there, arranged in rings taller than a person, some weighing several tons, left behind no confirmed evidence of cultivated grain, no pottery, and only limited signs of animal domestication. They were hunter-gatherers, people who still relied heavily on wild resources, not the settled farming societies the old model assumed monuments required. And yet the coordination it took to quarry, shape, transport, and erect those pillars implies a level of social organization once widely associated with settled agricultural societies. So here is the question this hilltop forces on us, one that unravels a century of assumptions about how civilization began. What if it wasn't food that built some of the earliest monumental structures we know of? What if it was something closer to belief? And if that's even partly true, what does it mean that human beings organized themselves into something resembling society before they had an obvious survival reason to do it at all? Try to stand where those pillars stand. Roughly 11,000 years ago, long before the wheel or writing, someone on that hill decided that slabs of limestone weighing several tons needed to be cut from nearby quarries, in some cases hundreds of meters away, using ropes, timber, and coordinated human labor, though exactly how they moved the largest pillars remains uncertain. Then they needed to be shaped. Fox, boar, scorpion, and vulture emerge in relief from the stone, carved with flint. No writing system survives to explain what these symbols meant. No named priesthood, no king. And yet the scale of the undertaking, the planning, the food required to sustain the workers, the willingness of dozens or hundreds of people to spend a season on something offering no obvious shelter or immediate reward, implies a form of cooperation historians once assumed only settled societies could achieve. The investigation into how this could happen has taken archaeologists somewhere the old textbooks never went. In the same broad period, across the Levant, a culture known as the Natufians was already doing something unusual for hunter-gatherers, staying in one place for extended stretches. Wild wheat and barley grew densely enough in the region that groups built semi-permanent stone dwellings, ground grain with stone tools, and buried their dead beneath the floors they lived on. Burying ancestors beneath the floor of a home suggests that these places had acquired a significance that went beyond simply being a temporary camp. The Natufians weren't farming yet, not in the way we'd recognize it. They occupied a hinge point, settled but still gathering wild food, caught between two entirely different ways of being human. What Göbekli Tepe suggests, and what excavations at Çatalhöyük in central Turkey later reinforced, is that this hinge point wasn't purely economic. Çatalhöyük, inhabited from around 7100 BCE, grew into a town of thousands, living in mud brick houses packed so tightly that residents entered through openings in the roof, crossing rooftops the way we'd cross streets. Archaeologist Ian Hodder, who led decades of excavation there, documented something striking. Interior walls were covered in plastered bull skulls and painted murals, replastered and repainted again and again across generations, as if meaning itself needed constant renewal. People in these early towns weren't simply surviving. They were performing, remembering, believing, building an inner symbolic life nearly as elaborate as the walls that housed it. And this is where the story takes its first real turn. For decades, monuments like Göbekli Tepe were explained as something a settled, well-fed society built to celebrate its own success. But the site's oldest monumental structures predate the widespread establishment of fully domesticated farming communities in the region. Some researchers now propose that the sequence long assumed, settle, then farm, then worship, may not hold, or at least not as a simple one-way chain. It's possible that feeding workers who gathered seasonally at a ritual site created exactly the kind of pressure, large-scale cooperation, food storage, long-term planning that later pushed nearby communities toward deliberately managing wild grain. This remains a hypothesis, actively debated among archaeologists, not a settled conclusion, but it reframes the question in a way the old model never could. Not settlement causing religion, but shared purpose and shared gathering, possibly pulling settlement into being. It's worth pausing on how strange that is. It suggests early humans may not have organized into complex societies simply because life finally became easier. They may have organized because something mattered enough to make life harder for a while on purpose together. Feeding dozens or hundreds of people for months, using only wild game and foraged plants, would have demanded the same kind of cooperation and planning that later defined farming villages. In other words, the gathering itself may have been the pressure that forced invention, not the reward for having already invented it. Not every scholar agrees on how far to take this. More recent excavation at Göbekli Tepe has uncovered domestic debris and animal bone alongside the monumental pillars, complicating the clean line once drawn between temple and settlement. The site may have combined ceremonial and everyday life in ways the earliest interpretations didn't anticipate. That uncertainty is worth sitting with rather than smoothing over. What most researchers do agree on is the broader pattern. Whatever mix of belief, cooperation, and desire for stability drove people to that hill, a similar pattern shows up again at Jericho, at Çatalhöyük, and across the wider Fertile Crescent. People choosing to stay, to build, to bury their dead close, to carve meaning into stone, in some cases before they had guaranteed harvests to justify it. The human cost of that choice is easy to miss in a story about monuments. Skeletal evidence from many early farming populations shows a measurable biological toll that was generally less pronounced among their more mobile predecessors. Increased dental disease from grain-heavy diets, signs of nutritional stress, greater exposure to infectious disease from crowded living, and joint damage from repetitive labor. Settling down in many of these populations did not make life easier. It was a trade, mobility and dietary variety for permanence and surplus, personal autonomy for the beginnings of hierarchy. But settlement alone doesn't explain a city. Once a community grew large enough to reliably feed itself, something else became possible. Not everyone had to farm. Some could spend their days shaping pottery instead. Others could quarry stone, weave cloth, or trade goods brought from valleys and coastlines far beyond walking distance. Surplus grain didn't just fill more stomachs. It freed a portion of the population to do something other than grow food, and that single shift is what separates a large village from the beginnings of a city. By the late 4th millennium BCE, southern Mesopotamia had produced cities on a scale the world had never seen. The city of Uruk grew to tens of thousands of people, with monumental temples, organized labor, and long-distance trade networks reaching into Anatolia and the Persian Gulf. And once thousands of people were doing thousands of different jobs, farming, building, trading, worshiping, someone needed a way to keep track of it all. Who owed grain, who had delivered it, who was owed in return. In Mesopotamia, that bookkeeping problem appears to have been one of the major pressures behind the earliest writing systems. Civilization's first sentences weren't poetry, they were inventory. Seen this way, the birth of civilization looks less like a single invention and more like a feedback loop. Gathering encouraged cooperation. Cooperation encouraged settlement. Settlement created the conditions and the pressure for managing food more deliberately. Food production, once it took hold, allowed gatherings larger than anything before it, which in turn allowed specialization, administration, and eventually the written word. No single step caused the next in a straight line. Each one fed the others, looping back and amplifying, until something we'd recognize as a town and eventually a city emerged from the loop itself. That loop is still visible in us. Every skyline, every crowded street, every stone monument still standing descends from that same original willingness to gather, to cooperate, to build something none of the builders would live to see finished. Not because survival demanded it, because on some level it mattered enough to try. Göbekli Tepe still doesn't answer the question of what, exactly, pulled people together on that hillside 11,000 years ago. But it asks a version of that question that feels strangely current, not what once pushed us into permanence, but what still convinces any of us that something is worth building beyond our own lifetime.